Hello, I'm Carolyn Graham from the VCU RRTC. I'm the research director for the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment of People with Physical Disabilities. Today I'll be talking about the barriers and facilitators to employment, the research findings from a national survey of people with physical disabilities. VCU RRTC on Employment of People with Physical Disabilities is funded by NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. The grant number is 90RT503502. And the contents of this presentation do not necessarily represent the policy of NIDLR. There's a growing body of knowledge on the barriers of employment and the supports needed to promote employment outcomes in people with physical disabilities. The information that is out there, the growing body, is qualitative, primarily qualitative research from our group and from others. However, it is less clear what people with physical disabilities know about these supports and services that can negate the barriers and facilitate employment. So what we asked in our national survey what they know, what was important for them to know. In our past and present studies in this subject, we have looked at the item analysis of the survey scales, which indicated that barriers, access, information resources, and lack of access and service supports varied across the physical disability types. Specifically, there were differences found in the proportion of individuals experiencing these individual barriers and facilitators. And so we were looking at more of the frequency, the percentage of people in the disabilities and how they differed across, and they did differ across. This study will focus on the differences in the aggregate degree of barriers and facilitators by the physical disability type. In other words, we're going to look at the total scale scores and see what degree in which they differ. How we developed our survey. We used focus groups of people with physical disability. Each group was consisted either of employed or unemployed people with specific disability. And we had focus groups with people with CP, MS, spinal cord injury, and then groups with other physical disabilities. For each of the disabilities, such as CP or spinal cord injury, we would have an a focus group that had only employed people with CP. And then we'd have another focus group with people with CP that were unemployed, and we did that for all of the groups. All individuals were between the ages of 18 and 65, and the focus groups were 1 hour long, and they were conducted over the telephone. We gathered this qualitative data from 152 individuals with the physical disabilities. There were 18 telephone focus groups. Again, each focus group, the focus groups were either employed or unemployed people with a specific disability. For instance, there were focus groups with employed people with spinal cord injury, and another focus group with unemployed people with spinal cord injury. The qualitative data was analyzed, codes and themes were developed. The team used consensual agreement and agreeing to the codes and the themes. And the team used findings to determine the 5 domains for the survey. And the 5 domains are access, barriers, information and resources, lack of access, and services and supports. These findings were also used to create the survey items with each domain. Also, the focus groups, the data from the focus groups were used in writing qualitative research papers. and have been reported in previously. The survey was online. The goal was to obtain 100 people with CP, 100 people with MS, and 100 people with SEI. And we used a variety of strategies, including sending letters to local chapters of these associations that were found online, posting on Facebook, posting on websites, and email distribution. And so we used a target sampling technique in collecting data. And we reached out to 5 national organizations: the National Council on Independent Living, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, the United Cerebral Palsy Association, the United Spinal Association, the World Institute on Disability. And then for an incentive, we had 100 people that participated in the study were randomly selected to receive a $25 gift card. And there's the 5 national organizations again. The total sample is 345. We ended up broadening our scope and not just getting the spinal cord injuries, the cerebral palsy, and the multiple sclerosis. We let anyone with physical disabilities participate, and that increased our sample. The 345 were the total ones that we used in the analysis. There were 12 that were deleted because no disability was reported. 11 were deleted that were over 65 years of age, and 1 was deleted because it was a duplicate. So there was 369 total respondents, but we only used 345. The demographics for this group, the mean age was 43.73 with a standard deviation of around 12. The range ranged from 19 to 65. 62% were employed and 38% were unemployed. And we were hoping for a larger unemployed, but we still got a nice group of people. It was predominantly female, with 63.8% being female, and only 6% were Hispanic or Latino. As you can see in this table, it was predominantly white, with 74.8% being white and 13% being black or African American. Education. It was a fairly well-educated group of people that participated. As you can see, bachelor's degree, 33% had a bachelor's degree, and 28% had a graduate degree. And this needs to be taken in consideration when thinking about these findings, because if we had a less educated population sample, then it would have been, the findings might have been different. The income range was primarily in the lower range, as would be expected. So as you can see, there were 30% less than $24,000, and most people made less than $60,000. Most people, yeah. There were a number that did not, 133 did not report income range. And so we examined why they did not report. What were some characteristics, and specifically educational level was one thing that we looked at. 24% had a high school diploma, and 29% of these who did not report their income had a bachelor's degree. So it was it varied across educational levels. And this is the breakdown on the disability types. We had 106 participants with multiple sclerosis, and next came the CP with 76, and spinal cord injury was 61. we had 102 people that did not fit into those three categories, and they fell out into MD, orthopedic impairment, spina bifida, arthritis, amputation, post-polio, post-stroke, traumatic brain injury, and other. Our first research question was to determine what was the greatest barrier to employment they experienced. Overall, 17% responded that they had concerns with losing benefits and access to health care. 15% were concerned about health concerns, specifically the unpredictability of health status. And then 14% just the ability to mobility, the ability to move around during their employment. And 13% were concerned about employer attitudes about hiring people with disabilities. Now that was overall. When we looked at this from the three major disability groups, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, and spinal cord injury, we saw some variance. We saw that the majority of those with cerebral palsy reported that employer attitudes about hiring people with disabilities was a major concern. And for multiple sclerosis, we found out that it was mobility that was a concern, a major concern. And for spinal cord injury, it was the concern with losing benefits and access to health care. That was their major concern. So it varied across, what was the greatest barrier, varied across these three disability groups. The themes that we found in the focus groups became our 5 scales: access, barriers, information and resources, lack of access, and services and supports. The scale that we developed for access had 8 items with the total score ranging from 0 to 40. The Cronbach's alpha was 0.72. And a sample item was something like, do you currently have access to accessible transportation? And then they could respond, don't know, not needed, no access, rarely access, some access, and ample access. Now we analyzed the don't knows separately from the others. So when we looked at the scale, used the scale, we were looking at not needed, no access, rarely access, some access, and ample access. For the barrier scale, there were 14 items, and this total score ranged from 0 to 70, could range from 0 to 70. The Cronbach's alpha was 0.88, so that was very good. A sample item was, tell us if the item has been a barrier to your findings in keeping a job. And one of those was unpredictability of health and medical needs. And again, the response scale was don't know, never a barrier, rarely a barrier, often a barrier, and always a barrier. Don't know, again, was analyzed separately and not part of the total scale score. Information and resources had 7 items with a total score possibly ranging from 0 to 49. Cronbach's alpha 0.7, which is fair. The samples item was how important is the following information or resources for you to achieve your work goals? Information on how working impacts my benefits. And this would include your Social Security income. The 5-point scale was don't know, not at all important, slightly important, somewhat important, and extremely important. Again, we were wanting to know how important this information was, and that's why the scale responses were a little bit different on this scale. Lack of access was 8 items for a total score range of 0 to 40. The Cronbach's alpha for this scale was 0.81. And a sample item is a lack of access to these types of information, a barrier to finding and keeping a job. Reasonable accommodation provided by the employer. And they had to respond whether reasonable accommodations provided by employer was not needed, not a barrier, somewhat of a barrier, a moderate barrier, extreme barrier, or I don't know. Services and supports. There were 12 items. the total scores ranged from 0 to 60, and the Cronbach SAFA was 0.88. And the questions were something like, how important are these services for achieving your goals? And one of those items was job search and placement assistance. And the response scales was don't know, not needed, not at all important, slightly important, somewhat important, and extremely important. Again, don't know was not used in the analysis for the scale, and it was not used on any of the scales. We did group for this presentation. We were just presenting on the group comparisons on the total score scales. So the disability types we compared were cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, orthopedic impairment, and spinal cord injury. These were the four major ones. And the dependent measures were total score of access, total score of barriers, total score of information and resources, total score of lack of access, and the total score of services and supports. Research 2, are there differences among the disability types in the amount of current access? We found that there were significant differences among the disability groups on current access. And we found that people with cerebral palsy and spinal cord injury reported greater access than people with multiple sclerosis. And there were no differences in access for the individuals among CP, spinal cord injury, and orthopedic impairment. It was the multiple sclerosis that had the lower amount of current access. And as you can see here, the multiple sclerosis people had a mean average of 23.89, where people with CP or spinal cord injury was over 28. The next research question is, are there differences among disability types and the amount of barriers to find and keeping a job? And there was no significant differences in the overall barriers experienced in finding and keeping a job. All of them were very similar. The means ranged from 34 to 38, but there was no significant difference among the four groups. Research question 4, are there differences among the disability types and the amount of importance placed on the information and resources to achieve your work goals? And there was no significant difference, again, among the four disability types. They were very similar on the means. They all were just around 20, which was moderate a score for this scale. Research question 5, are there differences among the disability types on the lack of current access to information and resources that result in a barrier to finding and keeping a job? And here we found a significant difference among concerning the lack of access. Individuals with MS had less access to information and resources than people with spinal cord injuries or people with orthopedic impairments. The mean for people with multiple sclerosis was 21, and the means for spinal cord injury was 25.20, and for orthopedic impairment was 27.8. There was no difference between the multiple sclerosis, people with multiple sclerosis, and the people with CP. But CP also had a lack of access to information and resources when compared to people with orthopedic impairment. The sixth research question was, are there differences among disability types on reported services and support to achieving your work goals? And there were no significant differences among the groups on access amount of importance placed on services and supports. And the means ranged from about 41 to about 45. After we looked at disabilities, compared disabilities by the scales, we compared by employment status. And here we had hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 stated employed individuals with physical disabilities will have greater current access than unemployed people with physical disabilities. And we found support for this hypothesis with employed individuals having greater access than those who were unemployed. Hypothesis 2 stated unemployed individuals with physical disabilities will report greater amounts of barriers to finding and keeping a job than employed people with physical disabilities. And we also found support for this too, with unemployed individuals reporting greater amounts of barriers than did people who were employed. Hypothesis 3 stated individuals who are unemployed will report greater importance to information and resources to achieve your work goals. And this was also found to be significant. Unemployed individuals with physical disabilities placed more importance on the information and resources than did employed. And hypothesis 4 stated unemployed individuals with physical disabilities will report less access to information and resources that result in barrier to finding and keeping a job than employed people with physical disabilities. And there was no difference. Both people who were employed and unemployed had very similar access to information and resources. And hypothesis 5, unemployed individuals with physical disabilities will place greater importance on services and supports in achieving work goals than employed people with physical disabilities. And again, there was no difference. They were very similar in their responses between the employed and unemployed. The conclusion to this study is differences were found in access among the disability types, with individuals with MS reporting less access than people with CP or spinal cord injury. There were differences in lack of access among disability types, with individuals with MS reporting less access than people with orthopedic impairment and spinal cord injury. Further, people with CP had less access than those with orthopedic impairment. And so here in both of these findings, it's the MS, the people with MS, that were having issues with access. Although there are differences in barriers and services and supports were found among the groups by individual items, no differences in the amount were found among the disability types at the scale level. So what I'm saying here is that the proportion who reported that there were barriers and services and supports among the groups in our previous study, it was talking about the proportion of people who reported. And here we're looking at the amount that each person reported. And so although there are differences in proportion of people who report differences in barriers and services and supports, there are no differences in the amount of or the degree in which they experience differences in barriers and services of support. And they all experience moderate degree of barriers to support. As far as employment status, employed individuals with physical disabilities had greater access than those who were unemployed. Unemployed individuals reported a greater degree of barriers than employed participants, and there was no differences found between employment status and the lack of access in services and supports. Unemployed people with PD placed greater importance on information and resources in achieving their work goals than employed individuals. Now, when we looked at it previously from the item analysis, we found that those who were unemployed placed importance on three specific areas: reasonable accommodations, work impact benefits, and accessible transportation. Reasonable accommodations and work impact benefits was over 90% of the individuals who were unemployed reported these as being important. In some, barriers and facilitators to employment can vary by physical disability type and employment status. Support for this has been reported in proportion and now in degree. Our next report will present findings on the predictors of barriers and facilitators to employment. Thank you.